The first night she slept up there, with the roof beams groaning above and snow piling on the shingles like a coffin lid, she swore she could feel the difference in her bones. And by morning, the water by her bed hadn't frozen. That was more than anyone else in the valley could say. They laughed behind their hands when she started soaring up the rafters. Old widow Colleen Rourke, all sinew and silent since her husband was buried last fall, stood on the roof of her own cabin in October, with a saw, a hammer, and 2 crates of bricks, hauled from the dry creek bed 2 miles down. No one helped her, and she didn't ask. She just kept working, even as the neighbors rode past in their wagons and looked up, half grinning, half puzzled. Some muttered things like, "Crazy old bird," or "She'll cave it in come snow," but mostly they just snorted and said it was a waste of energy. She should have been sealing her chimney tighter, filling cracks, insulating her root cellar like everyone else, not digging into the damn rafters. But Colleen hadn't survived the past winter by listening to men who'd only ever known the plains. She and Clive had come from the Pennsylvania highlands, where the wind cut your gums when you smiled, and wolves pressed up against the walls at night like smoke. Clive was gone now, lost to a fever that boiled him straight through before spring could thaw the ground enough to bury him proper. She'd buried him with a hatchet and her last 3 nails under the shed. Nobody knew that part. This winter, she wasn't going to be caught shivering in the dark. Not again, not while her joints ached like a thunderstorm was crouching over her spine, not while her hands couldn't even keep the matches dry enough to strike some mornings, and not while she still had the strength to swing a hammer, even if her fingers bled afterward. So she built a room inside the roof, not on the roof, not above it, inside. The idea had come during one of the coldest nights last February. She'd been huddled beside her stove, rocking with a quilt around her shoulders, when she noticed the air near the ceiling stayed warmer. Clive used to say warm air always rises, and she remembered him hammering nails barefoot while building the cabin, muttering about how the heat gets caught up there like a fly in syrup. It had struck her, in her half-frozen delirium, that the warmest part of her cabin was the part she couldn't reach. So now, in the dry days of late fall, while the men in town were stacking more firewood and trading hunting rounds, she was soaring into her own ceiling. She removed the entire crawl space, reinforced the trusses with old barn timber, built a steep ladder from the back wall, tucked behind where the stovepipe climbed. Every night she slept up there, under the peak of the A-frame, her body curled beneath 3 wool blankets, her breath fogging faintly in the air but never freezing. She laid bricks between rafters, added canvas sheeting soaked in bear fat for extra insulation, and sealed the tiny space with every scrap of knowledge Clive had left her. And it worked. 44 degrees warmer. She didn't measure it with any fancy thermometer. But when the neighbor boy came down with frostbite in both feet and the schoolteacher's ink froze on her desk, Colleen could still press her fingers to the wooden walls above her bed and feel something living there. Heat. The first to notice was Emmett Dunn, the blacksmith, whose own anvil had cracked from the cold one morning in November. He stopped by her place, uninvited, hoping to trade elk meat for dried apples. When she stepped out, bundled and rosy-cheeked, he squinted. "You been keeping a stove burning day and night?" he asked. "Nope," she said. "Just the one fire, like always." "You sure?" He sniffed at her coat. "Don't smell of smoke. Don't smell of nothing." She let him sniff, let him stare. Then she went back inside without offering him a thing. A week later, the gossip started turning. People had mocked her while she soared through the attic, said she was ruining the structure. That snow load would crush her by January. But January came, and she was still walking. February came, and her chimney smoked no more than theirs. By March, 2 babies in the valley had died from exposure, wrapped in 7 layers and still freezing in their cribs. Meanwhile, Colleen had started planting cabbage seeds in cups of warm dirt by the window. No one could figure out how she was keeping them alive. "She's hiding something," murmured the pastor's wife, who'd lost her own son to the cold the winter before. "Witchcraft, maybe." They always said that when a woman survived something they couldn't. The turning point came during the blizzard of March 2nd, the worst whiteout in a decade, the kind that took down barns and turned rivers to iron. Colleen had been preparing since November, packing beans into glass jars, sealing flour in oilcloth, and boiling water by the gallon to store in glass bottles for warmth. But what she hadn't expected was the knock. It came on the 2nd day of the storm, a rattling, shivering knock, so faint she thought it was just snow sloughing off the roof. Then it came again. She opened her door to find Ruth Tomlinson, the midwife, half frozen with a bundle in her arms. Behind her, trudging through snow waist-deep, came the preacher's apprentice and his younger sister. Their own cabin had caved in under snow load. They'd run through the white, screaming for help. Everyone else had their doors barred. Everyone else was out of wood or out of strength. Only Colleen answered. She let them in. Ruth collapsed by the stove and unwrapped the bundle. It was a baby, purple-lipped, silent, barely moving. "Put it up in the roof room," Colleen said. "Now." Ruth looked up at her like she'd gone mad. "What are you talking about? I said get up that ladder, put that baby up there, and wrap it tight." The girl obeyed. Colleen pushed the others toward it too. They climbed like rats escaping water, crowding into the space she'd built. 3 grown people, 1 newborn, and Colleen. The warmth held. The baby lived. After that, they didn't laugh anymore. But the worst wasn't over, because as the days passed and the storm raged on, more knocks came, louder ones, hungrier ones, and Colleen had to decide how many bodies could fit in a room not meant to hold even one. They came in 1s and 2s at first. Then, on the 4th day of the blizzard, they started arriving in packs, fathers dragging sleds stacked with bundled children, desperate mothers with frostbitten hands and faces red as rawhide. Some banged on her door like animals. Others called out through the white curtain of snow, their voices warbling in the wind, weak with cold and half-choked by the drifts. She could have kept the door locked, could have claimed the storm swallowed their cries, could have pretended not to hear, but every knock sounded like a heartbeat in her chest. She opened the door each time, and every time it became harder to shut it behind them. By nightfall, on the 5th day, there were 13 souls inside her cabin. Ruth and the baby had never left the roof room. They'd curled into the far corner under the sloped timber, huddled beneath the bare fat canvas with blankets Colleen had stitched from Clive's old shirts. The infant had taken to breathing again by the 2nd morning, his skin no longer the color of ash, and by day 3, he could cry. That sound echoed in the rafters like a hymn. The preacher's apprentice, Samuel, had stood near the stove most days, feeding logs from the dwindling pile of kindling she'd kept under the bench. He tried not to meet her eye. He'd been among those who'd once called her foolish, even unholy, for burying her husband herself. Now he didn't speak much at all. The others took what space they could, on chairs, against walls, near the root cellar door. Steam rose from their boots when they took them off. Several of the men had brought nothing but their coats and their pride, expecting shelter to mean salvation. But Colleen had planned for herself, not a congregation. They ran out of space before they ran out of silence. The roof room, barely 7 feet wide and 4 feet tall at its peak, became their only real warmth. It was never meant for more than 1, 2, at a stretch. But after Ruth and the baby came, the others insisted on their chance too. Colleen didn't argue. She rationed it, 2 hours at a time, in rotating shifts. The worst off were given first priority. The elderly, the infants, the bloodless. Everyone else took turns climbing the steep ladder, limbs shaking, holding their breath as they pulled aside the flap that sealed off the heat. By the end of that week, even the most skeptical among them whispered about the room as if it were alive. They called it the warmth, with a capital W, like some sacred thing that had chosen to stay in her rafters when God had left the valley. One man claimed he saw steam curling from the walls themselves, though Colleen knew it was just the moisture rising off their frozen clothes. Still, she didn't argue. She didn't argue with any of them, not even the ones who once laughed. But warmth comes at a cost. By day 6, the stove could no longer keep pace. Her supply of dry logs had been enough for one widow, not a family of 13. Even burning slower, the box inside the cast iron was half empty before dawn. The logs hissed and popped weakly, wet from snow that clung to coats and melted into the floorboards. "Where's the rest of your firewood?" one man asked her. Jonas Fairchild, the coop builder from East Ridge. She looked at him, her jaw stiff. "There isn't any rest. That was the firewood." He blinked. "No cordwood stacked outside? Would have been buried in the first night. What about under the porch?" "There is no porch. But the barn collapsed last January." He looked around the crowded room like someone had played a trick on him. "You mean this is all you have?" She pointed to the ceiling. And that, the room inside the roof, was the only thing keeping them alive. Not the stove, not anymore. Even with the fire glowing orange in the belly of the cast iron, the lower part of the cabin had dipped below freezing. Breath turned to fog. Ice formed around the cracks of the shuttered windows. But in the loft, wrapped in 3 layers of blankets and packed in like sardines, the temperature held. Warmth rose. That old rule hadn't failed her. It was the only reason no one died that week. But hunger was another matter. On the 8th day, their rations dwindled to 3 cups of oats, half a potato, and a single squirrel left salted in a jar. The flour had molded. The beans were gone. No one had left the cabin in 4 days, and the snow was still higher than the fence posts. When Colleen opened the front door, she had to push against it with her whole shoulder, and even then only a slit appeared, revealing a solid white wall. The path outside had vanished, swallowed by a silent white death. "We need meat," someone said, a voice from the back, near the root cellar door. "We won't make it to Sunday." Ruth looked at Colleen, cradling the baby. "There's nothing out there to hunt." No one said anything, but a few looked toward the cupboard under the window where the old tomcat used to sleep. It was empty now. He'd slipped out sometime during the first snow, and hadn't come back. Colleen's throat tightened. She stood slowly. "I'm going out." They tried to stop her. Ruth grabbed her wrist. "You go out there, Colleen. You won't come back." Colleen didn't flinch. "I've lived through 7 mountain winters. I'll come back." "What are you even looking for?" "Birch bark. Frozen mushrooms, anything with marrow." She didn't mention the half-snapped animal traps she'd left a mile west, hidden behind a ridge, baited with the last of her pickled meat back in October. If they hadn't snapped or frozen over, there might be something inside. She didn't dare say that aloud, didn't want to offer hope. She just pulled on Clive's old coat, tied it at the waist, and strapped the hunting knife to her hip. Then she opened the door and stepped into the blizzard. The white swallowed her. She couldn't see the fence posts, could barely make out her own boots. The air was so cold it sang through her teeth like glass. She kept her head down, leaning forward as she walked, using memory to navigate. 10 paces to the left of the woodpile, then north until the pine with the split trunk, then downhill until her boots started sinking. She fell twice. Her fingers turned numb by the time she reached the second ridge. Her breath rattled like tin inside her lungs. But the third trap, the one furthest out, had caught something. It was a fox, barely alive, but meat nonetheless. She snapped its neck clean, whispered a blessing over it. Then she wrapped it in her scarf and turned for home. The return trip nearly killed her. She'd wandered too wide. The wind carved out the landmarks. Her legs refused to lift. Her arms stiffened. She stumbled once and nearly didn't get back up. Snow filled her collar. Her fingers turned purple. She only found her cabin again by spotting the curl of smoke, faint as breath, rising through the drifts. When she finally kicked the door open, they rushed to her like she was carrying salvation in her hands. And in a way she was. That fox lasted 2 days, boiled, stewed, stripped of every bone. The marrow alone gave warmth. The pelt was turned into a makeshift mitten for the baby. They passed the stew in silence. Some wept while chewing. Colleen didn't eat. She said the meat was for the ones who couldn't fight for it. Her lips were cracked, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes still burned steady. She hadn't built a miracle. She'd built something better, a way to last. On the 10th day, the storm began to die. The wind thinned. The sky above turned a weak silver. The snow stopped hammering against the cabin and began to settle. The silence was no longer the sound of death, but of something waiting. They started digging out on day 11, with spoons, with boots, with frozen pieces of firewood, anything they could find. Samuel climbed to the roof with a shovel tied to his back and carved a path toward the chimney. When he looked down through the melting snow, he could see the sloped line of the roof room. His breath caught in his throat. "She built it right inside," he murmured. "Right into the bones of the house." Colleen, watching from below, said nothing. She didn't need to, but something had changed. Not just among the people inside, not just in how they looked at her, something deeper. When the sun returned, and light spilled into the cracks of the window, they didn't rush to leave. No one ran for town. No one sprinted to their own homesteads. They stayed, quiet, still, grateful, because in that cabin, inside that hidden, hand-built room in the rafters, something had defied winter, and that was a kind of holy no preacher could give them. When the thaw came, it did so with a vengeance. Snow melted fast, too fast, the kind that didn't soak gentle into the dirt but roared down slopes in grey floods, dragging fence posts and livestock with it. Streams swelled, ice cracked open into rivers, mud churned in great sheets across the valley floor, swallowing boots and unearthing old bones. But Colleen's cabin stood firm. Even as others around the valley leaked or buckled or simply rotted through from the weight of winter, hers held, walls steady, roof solid, and the secret room still warm. By then the others had begun to whisper a different kind of story about the widow and her house. They no longer called her crazy, they called her blessed. And that was worse, because after you survive a storm like that, people need to believe it came with a reason. They left her food on her porch now, cornbread in cloth wraps, smoked trout, even jars of molasses brought in from the preacher's own pantry. Children waved when she walked past. Men tipped their hats too low. Women nodded with a kind of guilty deference. And everywhere she went, someone asked her how she'd built the room. "What's it made of?" they'd say. "How'd you know it'd stay warm? Was it something Clive taught you?" She never answered the way they hoped, didn't give them a blueprint or some clever phrase, just looked them in the eye and said, "It's not what I built, it's what I didn't waste." But they kept asking, even weeks after the snow melted and the ground was soft again, because their cabins had failed them, and her roof had not. By mid-April, 3 families in the valley had started remodeling their attics. Timber prices soared. Men scoured old mining towns for canvas and clay mortar. One man, Harold Jimson, built a second story on his chicken coop and claimed he could feel the heat rising already, but none of it held like Colleen's, and none of them had the same kind of winter to test it with. The problem wasn't that people wanted to copy her. That much Colleen understood. It was survival. What unsettled her was the reverence. She came out one morning to find a wooden cross laid gently against her fence post, wrapped in blue ribbon. A few days later, someone placed a circle of river stones around the base of her chimney, with dried lavender tied to the rocks. By the end of the week, a girl from the East Farm stood on her porch steps before sunrise, hands clasped like she was about to pray. Colleen opened the door before the girl could knock. "Whatever story they told you," she said flatly, "it ain't true." The girl flinched. "They said you—" "I'm just a woman with a hammer. Go home." But stories have legs. By June, travelers from other towns were stopping at her fence line, eyes scanning the rooftop for signs of a miracle. A man from Mason Ridge tried to buy the cabin outright, offered 2 oxen, a quarter-acre of barley, and his own hunting rifle. Colleen turned him away with nothing but a shake of her head. That summer, Colleen kept mostly to herself. She planted in silence, dug fresh trenches around the perimeter for runoff, repaired her storm shutters. She didn't speak much to the others, unless they had a child in tow or a direct question about canning. But the gossip grew louder with every day of heat, because even in July, folks said, that roof room stayed cool. They didn't understand it wasn't the room, it was her. Then came the fire. Not a wildfire, not at first. It began in the east quarter of the valley, where the Jarrett family still burned pine knots for heat in July because their chimney never cleared right. A spark leapt, a curtain caught. Flames licked up their wall like a tongue, and the dry wind did the rest. 3 cabins burned that day. One woman's hand melted to her ladle trying to save the stew. A boy nearly suffocated. And even though the others rushed with blankets and buckets and wet shirts, it was Colleen's cabin that stayed untouched. Not because of luck, because she'd cleared brush in a 50-foot radius every spring since Clive died, dug a fire ditch by hand, hauled buckets from the creek and stored them in her cellar by the dozen. While others danced around their cabins praying for rain, Colleen had stood in her boots and dug. The fire died before it touched her fence, and by morning the whispers had started again. The idea that a woman alone could survive so much, the storm, the freeze, the hunger, now the fire, without any man beside her, without even a dog, was too much for some men to bear. They began calling her things, not to her face, not where they could see the knife still strapped to her hip like it had been all winter, but in saloons and at campfires. They said maybe she'd bargained with something, that maybe Clive hadn't died natural, that maybe the roof room wasn't a clever trick at all, but a pocket of hell disguised as mercy. One man, Curtis Bell, claimed he'd seen red light glowing from the shingles at night, but Colleen knew what Curtis had seen, the sun catching the chimney's soot at just the right angle. Fear makes fools fast. That fall, something changed again. One of the preacher's boys, Thomas, not the one who'd stayed in her cabin but the younger, came limping to her cabin in the middle of a storm. Not snow this time, but a late October sleet that cut down crops and soaked through even tarred canvas. He had a black eye, a cracked tooth, said his pa'd done it for backtalk, said he had nowhere else to go. Colleen didn't ask questions. She made him tea, let him sit by the stove, watched his hands shake while he tried to cup warmth like it might escape through his skin. "You want to stay up there?" she asked, nodding toward the ceiling. He didn't answer with words, just stood, climbed the ladder, and curled into the same spot Ruth had once held with her newborn. He stayed 3 days, left with boots too big and bread wrapped in cloth. Never said thank you. She didn't expect him to. They kept coming, one by one, all through the winter. A woman with red welts on her wrist from her husband's belt. A boy who'd lost his mother to fever and swore the frost was following him. Even a former cavalryman, drunk and shaking, mumbling about things he'd done at Wounded Knee. They came not for charity, but because her house held something no one else's did, something warm and steady and unseen, and because in the rafters of a widow's roof, hope had outlived winter. Then one night the girl from the fence line came back, the one who'd tried to pray on her porch. Only this time she was bloodied. Her hair was matted with mud. Her knees were scraped raw. She didn't knock, just slumped against the door, whispering. Colleen dragged her inside. "Who did this?" The girl blinked. "My uncle. Said I lied. Said I told folks he stole his neighbor's plow." "Did you?" The girl didn't answer. Didn't need to. Colleen gave her hot water, wrapped her hands, waited until she slept. Then she took her lantern, pulled on her coat, and walked out into the night. She never said what happened next. But 3 nights later, the uncle packed up and left town, took his ox and his tools and didn't say goodbye to anyone. And when someone asked Colleen, she just said, "He didn't like the winters." Spring came, and the roof room remained. She patched a leak near the west beam, replaced 2 bricks that had shifted, added a second canvas layer for the coming freeze. One afternoon in May, as she sat sewing in the sunlight near the ladder, A small knock came at the door. It was the preacher's apprentice, Samuel, now grown, now married, holding a boy by the hand. "We named him Clive," he said. Colleen blinked, hands still. "Why?" "For the man who saved us." She shook her head, voice low. "Clive's dead," he smiled. "I meant the room." By the following winter, 3 families had torn open their ceilings and rebuilt. One woman burned her chimney out by accident and wrote Colleen asking how to line the walls with fat-soaked canvas. Another asked if she could hire her to help install her own roof room. Colleen never charged, but she didn't help either. She just told them, "Build what you need, not what folks expect." Then she shut the door and climbed back into the warmth. The next winter didn't wait for December. It came early, angry, and without warning, like a debt collector pounding at the valley's doorstep with ice on its breath and hunger in its bones. The first snow fell in early November, weeks ahead of the usual freeze, and didn't melt. Instead, it clung, hardened, froze into slabs that made the horses slip and the wheels of wagons lock solid. The creek iced over in a single night, and by the 7th morning, a boy in the Miller family was found stiff in his bed, curled in blankets, his face white as a wax candle. People panicked, and panic in the valley meant noise, shouting, prayer, accusations. But beneath all that, a quiet consensus settled in like ash after a fire. They needed the widow again. She heard them long before they knocked. Colleen had learned to listen for the change in footsteps, how desperation dragged at a man's soles, how mothers stomped when trying not to cry, how children shuffled when they'd already gone too long without food. She heard them crunching through the snow that morning, a half-dozen bodies, all hesitant, all slow, like people approaching not a neighbor but something more like a shrine. The knock, when it came, was light, too light. She opened the door anyway. And there they stood, 6 of them, 3 adults, 3 children, faces pale, eyes hollow, boots caked in snow that hadn't melted. One man she recognized from a spring plowshare trade. Another was the woman whose sister had married Clive's cousin in the east. The others she didn't know. No one spoke. Then the smallest boy, maybe 6 years old, stepped forward and said, "Ma said your roof saves people." Colleen looked past him at the others. No one corrected the boy. No one looked her in the eye either. She turned without a word and walked inside, left the door open. It was all the invitation they needed. By the end of that week, 17 people had come through her threshold. Some stayed only a night, just long enough to warm the blood in their fingers and walk back to patchwork cabins with new hope. Others stayed longer, the ones with sickness, with wounds, with nowhere to go. They didn't even ask to go up to the room in the rafters anymore. They just waited for their turn, understanding now what it meant to be allowed there, how that space wasn't just insulation and fat-soaked canvas. It was earned. It was guarded. Colleen kept the same system, rotating shifts, the most fragile first, the youngest, the feverish, the grieving. She didn't change the rules, and no one argued. Not anymore. Not since the last winter. Not since the last blizzard, when some of them had nearly died on her floor, while others survived simply by breathing air that hung 4 feet higher. They knew now, warmth wasn't just a mercy. It was a currency, a ration, a blessing too rare to be abused. On the 12th day of snow, the baby Ruth had saved the year before returned. Now a toddler, now sick, she arrived holding him in her arms again, face haggard, breath shallow, lips pale as ash bark. She didn't speak until after the door had closed behind her and the boy was already up the ladder, wrapped in wool and carried by Samuel. "He's not breathing right," she said, voice cracking. Colleen didn't ask questions. She handed her the kettle and stoked the fire. All night the child coughed, thin, watery wheezes like a bird trapped in a chimney. Ruth didn't sleep, neither did Colleen. At dawn, the boy stopped coughing and breathed smooth. Ruth wept into her hands without shame. Colleen watched from her stool, fingers laced, eyes dry. "I thought he'd die like my first one," Ruth whispered. Colleen didn't reply. She just turned her head slightly toward the ceiling, toward the room above them, then back to the fire. But the winter didn't relent. February brought bitter winds. Roofs cracked, wells froze. One cabin collapsed under snow so heavy it warped the joists. The town's store ran out of dried goods by the 3rd week, and even the preacher rationed communion wine so far it turned clear with melted snow. Then the fevers started. Nobody could say where they came from. The cold, the hunger, the close quarters. Maybe it didn't matter. One boy got it first, then a mother, then a hunter, then the pastor's wife, burning up in their beds, shivering from heat instead of cold. And when they did sweat, the chill in the air turned that sweat into ice, and that ice into death. It wasn't the cold now that was killing people. It was their own bodies. Colleen heard about the first 2 deaths from Samuel. He'd been trying to deliver elderberry syrup between families, a job the preacher could no longer manage. His voice shook when he told her. She was 28, just laid down, and stopped breathing. Colleen stared at the fire for a long time after that. Then she stood, walked to the stove, and took down the clay jar she hadn't touched in 3 winters. Inside it were the last of Clive's herbs, tiny sprigs, dried curls of roots, a few pinches of something he'd brought west called ghost mint. Used to say it could kill the heat that killed a man faster than snow ever could. She ground it with mortar and boiled it slow. Then she poured it into cloth-wrapped bundles and handed them out. "Hang this near the sick." "Not over the fire, just near." "Will it cure them?" Ruth asked. "No," Colleen said, "but it'll give them a fighting chance." The fever spared her cabin. No one knew why. Maybe the herbs, maybe the way she boiled water day and night, filling the room with steam. Maybe it was the cold itself. Her roof room didn't allow for sweat. The warmth never turned to heat, just stayed steady, gentle, dry. No one overheated. No one coughed blood. One child fell ill, slept in the rafters for 2 nights, and woke up breathing clear again. The rumor spread so fast, Colleen had people lining up in the storm. A widow with 3 children came from 12 miles away. A trapper left his dogs behind to walk here, burning with fever. She let in who she could, turned away who she couldn't, and cried only when no one could see. That spring, after the fever broke, the town held a meeting, not in the church. Its roof had buckled in March, but under a canvas tent near the creek where the thaw had started carving trails again. 53 people gathered. Most of them had survived because of Colleen's cabin or because of someone who had. They stood in mud, faces pale, eyes heavy with the kind of gratitude that turns into obligation. And the mayor, a man who'd once called her mad as a mountain bear, stood up and said, "We should honor her." Some clapped, others nodded, no one disagreed. But Colleen, when word reached her, shook her head. "I didn't build that room for praise," she told Ruth. "I built it so I could stop waking up with frost on my hair." "That room saved more people than any preacher," Ruth said gently. "It saved me first," Colleen replied. That was enough. Still, they named it. Not officially, not with signs, but in the stories. They called it the room that held the warmth. Children whispered about it at school. Women traced the angles of their own roofs, wondering how high they could build. A young man claimed he'd seen the warmth flicker through the shingles like candlelight. No one believed him, but no one mocked him either. That was the power of the story now. Not belief, but possibility. Years passed. Children grew. Fires came and went. Storms tore new paths through the trees. A second fever swept through in a later spring, weaker than the first, and Colleen aged. She never rebuilt the cabin, never added a second story or a porch, or even a railing to the ladder. She left it all as it was, as it had been the day she first crawled into the ceiling alone with a blanket and a breath that didn't freeze. She died on a cold night, in her bed, under the eaves, face toward the ceiling, hands folded, eyes closed, and smiling. They buried her beneath the cabin, not beside it, beneath it, lowered her into the earth beneath the room that had saved her, the room that had saved them all, laid bricks around her, just like the ones she'd packed into the rafters all those years ago, wrapped her in wool, placed her hammer beside her, worn smooth from time. No stone, no cross, just a carving in the lintel above the cabin door, etched by someone whose name history won't remember. She built high, so we wouldn't fall low, and in winters to come, when frost gnawed at the windows and wolves howled from distant trees, children curled into their own attic rooms, bundled in quilts, whispering to each other about the woman who defied the cold, not with magic, not with men, but with her hands, her hunger, and her belief that warmth, real warmth, was something you could build with your own 2 fists. And in the silence of the snow-covered roofs, above the valleys where others had once frozen, her story stayed 44 degrees warmer. In her cabin, in the room she built, alone, midwinter, Elias snorted. "Fine, long as someone keeps the fire going." "No fire," Samuel said. "What kind of test is that? The kind that proves your mouth don't run warmer than your blood?" The room stirred. Something electric passed between the walls. The idea caught like dry kindling, and by dawn, it was decided. January 14th. It smelled faintly of pine pitch and smoke, and something older, like worn cloth. The warmth was real, subtle, but present, like stepping into a memory of heat. He climbed. The room was small. Smaller than he expected. Low ceiling, barely enough room to sit. Bricks packed between rafters. 2 layers of waxed canvas. A blanket folded in the corner. He settled in. The door was barred, and the wind began to howl. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees. Outside, Samuel sat by a fire, alone. The others had gone, some scoffing, some worried. A few left food near the door, a half gesture of hope. Inside, Elias began to shake, not from cold, from something else. He'd expected discomfort, a chill maybe, a long night, but the silence pressed on him like a second skin. He swore he could hear the beams creak with breath. The canvas fluttered with a rhythm he couldn't name, and worse, he could hear his heartbeat too clearly. He wrapped the blanket tighter, but it didn't help because it wasn't the cold that got to him. It was the sense that he didn't belong here, that this room wasn't his, that he was trespassing. Around 2 a.m., the snow intensified. Wind tore down the valley, screaming through cracks like banshees. The cabin held as it always had, but the pressure built. The air got heavy. The cold tried to claw in. Elias lay curled, eyes wide, hands numb. He heard something then, not wind, a sound inside the walls, not words, but breath. A slow, steady, warming exhale. He didn't sleep, not a second. When Samuel unlocked the door at dawn, Elias stumbled out like a man who'd seen too much sea, pale, silent, trembling. He didn't speak, didn't boast, didn't scoff, just walked through the crowd without meeting any eyes and left town within the week. They say he moved south, warmer climates, bought land somewhere in the desert. Refused to speak of the night ever again. Samuel never commented. He just went back to the cabin and cleaned the room. It sat empty after that. For years. No more visitors. No more skeptics. The town let it rest. Because something had shifted. They didn't just believe the story now. They respected it. Knew it wasn't just about warmth or survival, or even Colleen. It was about limits, about how much a person could take, about how high you had to build when the world kept pulling down, and decades later when the valley faced another winter, the worst in half a century, one that tore roofs, killed cattle, and froze men where they stood. They didn't run to the store. They didn't pray. They climbed into their attics, into their rafters. They built their warmth above their heads. Because the widow had taught them, when the world freezes around you, you don't dig deeper.